Welcome to EKU Then and Now. I'm your host, Paul Blanchard, and I recently retired after a 35-year career as a faculty member and administrator at Eastern. This monthly series will focus on prominent EKU faculty, staff, and alumni who have had a meaningful involvement at Eastern during its history of more than 100 years. They will comment on what EKU has been like during its storied past, how it has changed, and what we might expect its future to hold. Our guest this month is Dr. Hank Everman, a prominent member of the EKU Social Science and History faculty for many years. He grew up in Kentucky and did his undergraduate work at the University of Kentucky before pursuing graduate work at LSU, where he received his PhD in history. He came to EKU in the fall of 1970, when I did, and taught social science, world history, American history, and Greco-Roman history until his retirement in the spring of 2004. He has authored or co-authored 5 books, mostly about state and local history in Kentucky, and is a well-known speaker throughout the state where he has given numerous speeches to historical, civic, and church groups. We will be talking about people and events at EKU over the last 4 decades. And Hank, welcome. Thank you for doing this. Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you decided to come to EKU as a faculty member in the early 1970s?
In 1969, I was up here at Christmas time, and I was working on my dissertation, and I did something atypical. I came to Richmond, campus was shut down, and I called President Martin. And I told him I wanted to come home when I finished my doctorate in the spring, and I would like to see if there was a job at Eastern. And he said, well, not in the history department, but we have a social science department where they teach world history, and I had been teaching world history. So he said, I'll set up an interview for you with the appropriate people before you go back to Louisiana.
Wow.
And so unlike most of the people you've probably interviewed who would have started at the bottom and worked their way up, I had an interview with President Martin on a Monday morning, and he sent me down the hall to the Vice President Stovall's office, and then Dean Lewis took me to lunch, and finally in the afternoon I met Ken Tennell, who was the chairman of the Social Science Department.
Now this was still during the Christmas break?
This was during the break, '69, and of course I returned to Louisiana in January. And they told me at the time that they could not offer me a job. There were no openings at the moment, but because of the uproar in Vietnam and the war protests, that there were going to be some changes and that there would be positions. And since I would have a doctorate and really wanted to come back to Kentucky, they felt confident that I might get a job and not to accept anything too quickly. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So by the spring, Dr. Tennell contacted me, and of course I signed the contract.
So that was March or April, or
I think it was late March.
Well, that's a very interesting story. I've heard one other person, and I can't, geographer of somewhere that went to Dr. Martin first. And okay. Do you recall? And of course, I want to ask you more about Dr. Martin, but when you called him at home, and did he seem offended, or?
He seemed surprised.
Surprised, yeah.
But I conveyed my interest and my enthusiasm, and I told him I had family in Corbin in Paris, and he even asked me if I knew the mayor of Corbin, who happened to be a friend of his, and I did. And he asked me about a couple of teachers in Paris. And when I came to the interview, it was so unorthodox. He opened his mail and looked at his mail the whole time, and he'd kind of peer over envelope every once in a while, and he said, do you always wear a coat and tie? And I said, yes, sir, I'm from the old school. And I said, I wear a coat and tie in an unair-conditioned room in Louisiana. And
that was the right thing to say.
I think that was the right thing to say. Of course, I didn't know him at all. And
but you were just
I was told later
yeah.
that my honesty probably helped me. And even Dr. Tennell, when I had the interview that Monday afternoon, he said, well, I don't know that I even need to talk to you because I think decisions have been made higher up. And he said, I want you to know that my wife knows you. And I said, I don't know any Mrs. Tennell. And he said, oh, Jan Rose was your elementary public school music teacher. She said you were little Hank Everman. And I said, oh, I know her. I grew up across the street from her grandparents.
We'll come back to Dr. Martin in a minute, but can you think of any memorable people on campus in the 1970s, that first decade that you and I were here, especially in social science and history and arts and sciences?
Two people in particular stand out. One was Dean Lewis, Clyde Lewis, who was pretty much like President Martin in that he ran a tight ship and did not like a lot of disagreement. You could disagree, but if you persisted, it created problems. He had a tremendous vision of interdisciplinary education, which he explained in part when I had the interview with him. But he told me that one of the conditions for all the new faculty would be that we would meet weekly in a seminar situation with Dixie Milam, who he considered the outstanding professor in the social science department. And she was the most memorable person. I think in my early career, she was a fantastic teacher, and she not only explained how we needed to weave all these social sciences together in our world history classes, but she gave us some tips about teaching. And very early on, I noticed that she always had students in her office or talking to her before and after class. And while I enjoyed good relations with students, I thought I could learn from her. So I asked her how she maintained a constant stream of students. And she said, well, Hank, I have them come in and one-on-one if they are having problems in the class. So that first year I taught, I decided I would not only have the students that were struggling coming to my office, but I needed to be optimistic. So I introduced a mandatory requirement. All my students had to have a one-on-one conference after the first test. And as a result, I had students in my offices all the time. And I watched her. She always went to class a little early. Many teachers go at the last minute. So I started going to class usually 10 minutes before a class would start. And I would interact with the students that way. And I think many of them appreciated it. They told me later, or since I've retired, how much they enjoyed our conferences and my willingness to meet with them.
That's interesting, because I was talking to a former colleague of both you and me. Well, I'll mention his name, Charlie Sweet, longtime English professor, and he was saying, I think he came here in 1970 also, and he said that a new professor, nobody really teaches you how to teach.
That's right.
You don't get it in graduate school. But that's an amazing story. I've never heard that Dixie Milam was the mentor.
There were 10 of us in her sessions. 10 of us came in 1970 because there was such a turnover. Some left willingly and some were dismissed, failed to get tenure.
Well, and you had a role model too.
We did. We really did.
That's really a great story.